I do know that Blake Lively has been surrounded by some very uncomfortable questions about powerful men in Hollywood, and now those questions are coming back in a way that is getting harder for people to ignore. But before we go any further, there's one important distinction we need to make. Some of the claims circulating about Blake, her former publicist Leslie Sloan, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and other Hollywood figures are allegations, interpretations, or disputed accounts. They should not automatically be treated as proven facts, simply because they are repeated online. That said, there is a reason people are revisiting this entire timeline right now. Because once you start looking back at the relationships, interviews, business connections, and public comments that surrounded Blake Lively over the years, a much more complicated picture begins to emerge. And one of the names that keeps appearing in that discussion is Leslie Sloan. According to claims being circulated online, Leslie Sloan, who has represented Blake Lively through Vision PR, also had professional connections to Harvey Weinstein at one point. That claim has become particularly controversial because it appears to conflict with a more recent statement attributed to Leslie's representatives. And that's where people started digging. Rather than simply accepting one side of the story, some online researchers went back through archived articles, entertainment reports, and older coverage looking for evidence of Sloan's professional history. One article that has resurfaced allegedly described Sloan as a spokeswoman for Weinstein. Another Page 6 report has also been cited by commentators as evidence that she represented him. Now, whether every interpretation of those reports is accurate is something that needs to be established through the original reporting and full context. But the reason people find it significant is obvious. If Sloan really did represent Weinstein professionally, it would provide important context for understanding the Hollywood network surrounding Blake at that particular time. And then another old report started getting attention. According to a 2014 Page 6 report cited by online commentators, the Weinstein Company allegedly provided financial backing that helped Sloan launch her own public relations company. The report also discussed celebrities connected to Sloan, including Blake Lively and Katie Holmes. And according to that same account, Weinstein was allegedly heard making an enthusiastic comment about Sloan's next professional move. That detail has been repeatedly brought back into the conversation because it raises a question people haven't stopped asking. How deeply interconnected were these Hollywood relationships behind the scenes? Again, professional representation does not automatically mean someone knew about another person's alleged misconduct. A publicist representing a powerful producer does not, by itself, establish complicity in that producer's actions. But when we're examining the history of an industry where powerful producers, actors, agents, publicists, studios, and media organizations constantly crossed paths, those professional relationships can provide context, and that context is exactly what critics are demanding right now. Because Blake Lively isn't suddenly being discussed in isolation. Her entire history in Hollywood is being re-examined. And that brings us to the much bigger claim now circulating online. Has Blake Lively's Hollywood image reached a breaking point? Some critics are describing it in extreme terms, saying she has effectively been pushed out of Hollywood. Now, that is a much stronger statement than the available evidence necessarily supports. A career can go through a downturn. A celebrity can face backlash. Projects can disappear. Public opinion can turn. And none of those things automatically mean someone has been permanently expelled from an industry. But there is no question that Blake has faced an enormous amount of negative attention. New information, old interviews, resurfaced clips, controversial headlines, and renewed discussions about her professional relationships have created a perfect storm of scrutiny. And what's particularly fascinating is that people aren't only talking about what happened recently. They're going backward. They're examining moments from years ago. They're asking whether certain comments should be interpreted differently today. They're revisiting interviews that once seemed completely ordinary. And they're asking whether the public missed warning signs because the people involved were simply too powerful, too famous, or too well protected. One of the biggest examples repeatedly brought up is Blake's past public comments about Harvey Weinstein. When allegations against Weinstein became a global scandal and the #MeToo movement exploded, Hollywood entered one of the most significant reckoning periods in its history. Actors spoke out, directors spoke out, producers spoke out, survivors shared their experiences. People who had spent years working in the industry began discussing the culture of fear and silence surrounding powerful figures. It was a moment when the entertainment industry was forced to confront questions it had avoided for years. And during that period, Blake Lively was asked about Weinstein because he had been involved with one of her earlier projects. Her response became controversial. In an interview with Good Morning America, Blake discussed the broader issue of sexual misconduct and emphasized that the problem extended far beyond Hollywood. She pointed out that mistreatment of women wasn't some new phenomenon created by the entertainment business. It was a much broader societal issue. That part of her response was widely consistent with the larger conversation taking place at the time. But then she discussed her own experience with Weinstein, and that's where critics began focusing intensely on her wording. Blake said that she personally had not experienced the behavior being described by other women. She explained that her own interactions with Weinstein had been positive, and that statement immediately created tension, because the public was simultaneously hearing devastating accounts from women describing experiences that were completely different. Her defenders argued that she was simply describing her own experience. Her critics argued that publicly emphasizing her positive experiences with Weinstein during such a sensitive moment could come across as minimizing the experiences of survivors. Those are two very different interpretations. And it's important not to pretend that one automatically proves the other. But the controversy surrounding the comments was real. The discussion became even more complicated when Blake acknowledged that people don't always know what happens behind closed doors. That statement was intended, at least according to the context of the interview, to recognize that a person can have one experience with someone while others may have completely different experiences. But critics weren't satisfied. They argued that the overall message sounded contradictory. On one hand, Blake was supporting the broader movement against sexual misconduct. On the other hand, she was describing her own experiences with Weinstein in positive terms. And for some viewers, that combination created the impression that Blake was trying to occupy both sides of an incredibly complicated conversation. That criticism followed her. Then came another interview that people have recently started resurfacing. This time, the focus was on Blake's comments about what she knew, or didn't know, regarding allegations surrounding Weinstein. Critics pointed to the evolution of her wording. At one point, she emphasized that she had never personally experienced that behavior. At another point, she explained that she hadn't heard specific stories about what was allegedly happening. To critics, the distinction sounded suspicious. They argued that saying you didn't personally experience something is very different from saying you had never heard rumors about it. But again, there is a crucial difference between criticism of someone's wording and proof that they knowingly concealed misconduct. There is no basis for simply declaring that Blake knew everything happening behind closed doors. That is an allegation, not an established fact. Still, the controversy raises an uncomfortable question about Hollywood in general. How much did people know, and when did they know it? That question became one of the defining issues of the Weinstein era. Because Weinstein was not operating in isolation. He existed inside a massive professional network. Agents knew him, publicists knew him, actors knew him, directors knew him, executives knew him, journalists covered him, and celebrities worked with him. The challenge is determining who actually knew what, rather than assuming that everyone connected to him automatically understood the full extent of his alleged behavior. That's why the resurfaced material about Leslie Sloan has attracted so much attention. People are trying to understand the network. They're trying to understand who worked with whom. They're trying to determine which relationships were professional, which were personal, and which claims have actually been documented. And then the conversation takes another dramatic turn, because after Weinstein, critics began pointing toward Blake's professional relationship with another controversial figure, Woody Allen. Blake Lively appeared in Allen's film Café Society, a movie set against the glamorous backdrop of 1930s Hollywood. At the time, Allen was already facing long-standing public controversy involving allegations made by his daughter Dylan Farrow. The debate surrounding Allen had been going on for years. Some actors had publicly distanced themselves from him. Others had expressed regret about working with him. Some donated money connected to their projects or salaries to charitable organizations. The broader entertainment industry remained deeply divided over how Allen should be viewed. And Blake's comments about working with him became another point of criticism. In interviews promoting the film, Blake described her experience with Allen in positive terms. She spoke about him being encouraging and empowering. She discussed how he allowed actors room to improvise and described the experience as creatively valuable. For Blake, that may have simply been her account of working with a director on a film. But critics interpreted it differently. They argued that she was once again emphasizing her personal experience with a powerful male filmmaker while avoiding the larger controversy surrounding him. And when journalists asked her about the allegations involving Allen, Blake reportedly emphasized the danger of making judgments about things she personally did not know. Her position was essentially that she could speak about her own experience, and her own experience, she said, was positive. That statement became controversial for obvious reasons. To supporters, it was a reasonable boundary. You cannot personally verify every allegation involving every person you meet. To critics, however, it looked like another example of a celebrity prioritizing her professional experience with a powerful man over the allegations being discussed publicly. And that is where the internet began constructing what it calls a pattern. The argument goes like this. When Blake worked with powerful men who could influence Hollywood opportunities, she publicly described those professional relationships in positive terms. Weinstein, Allen. And now, years later, people are revisiting those interviews and asking whether the pattern is meaningful or simply the result of Blake describing her own experiences. That's the central question. Because there's a massive difference between recognizing a pattern in someone's public statements and proving that person intentionally protected powerful men. One is interpretation, the other requires evidence. And that's where much of the online debate has gone off the rails. Some commentators have taken old interviews and presented their interpretations as definitive proof. Others have gone in the opposite direction and dismissed every criticism as meaningless celebrity gossip. The truth is likely more complicated. Blake can have genuinely positive personal experiences with someone, while other people experience that same person completely differently. Both things can theoretically be true at the same time. And acknowledging that does not invalidate survivors. It also doesn't automatically prove that Blake knowingly participated in protecting anyone. But the controversy isn't disappearing, because now every old interview is being viewed through a new lens. Every connection is being examined. Every publicist relationship is being questioned. Every quote is being replayed. And every time Blake described a powerful man as empowering, people began asking whether that language meant more than they initially thought. Was she simply talking about her own professional experience? Was she trying to avoid commenting on allegations she couldn't personally verify? Was she attempting to protect a project, or was there something else happening behind the scenes? Those are questions people can debate, but until direct evidence emerges, they remain questions. And perhaps that's what makes this entire story so explosive. The internet wants a simple answer. It wants heroes and villains. It wants one person who was right and another who was wrong. But Hollywood scandals rarely work that cleanly. Power networks are complicated. Professional relationships are complicated. People's knowledge is complicated. And public statements can be interpreted in multiple ways. Still, Blake Lively's current situation shows just how quickly the past can come back. A comment made years ago can suddenly become a trending clip. An old article can suddenly become evidence in an online investigation. A professional relationship that nobody cared about 10 years ago can suddenly become the center of a controversy. And once that happens, the celebrity has to answer for not only what they're doing today, but also how people interpret everything they did yesterday. That's why this story is getting so much attention. The question isn't simply whether Blake Lively is facing criticism. She clearly is. The real question is whether the resurfacing of these old connections and interviews represents a temporary internet backlash or the beginning of a much deeper re-evaluation of her Hollywood career. And if the public keeps digging, there could be more old interviews, more archived reports, and more forgotten relationships coming back into the spotlight. Because once the internet starts pulling on one thread, it rarely stops with one thread. It keeps pulling, and eventually, you may discover that the story everyone thought they understood was only the surface. So now the question becomes, what else is buried in Blake Lively's Hollywood history that the public hasn't looked at closely enough yet? Because if more documented information emerges, the conversation surrounding Blake could become even more intense. And this time, it won't just be about one movie, one interview, or one controversy. It could become a complete reassessment of the Hollywood network surrounding her for years, and that is exactly why this story isn't going away anytime soon. And calling Blake Lively a feminist in this context is exactly where critics say the entire argument starts to fall apart. Because according to her critics, repeatedly using the word empowering while discussing powerful men accused of serious misconduct doesn't empower women at all. They argue that it risks minimizing the experiences of women who came forward and endured consequences that had nothing to do with glamorous movie premieres, celebrity friendships, or Hollywood status. To those critics, that language feels like an insult to the many professional, capable, intelligent, ambitious, and powerful women who have spent years fighting to be taken seriously in an industry where power has historically been concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group of influential people. And that's why Blake's use of the word empowering has become such a lightning rod. Critics argue that she used the language of female empowerment while simultaneously benefiting from relationships with powerful men. Whether that interpretation is fair is another question. Blake has repeatedly described her own professional experiences, and having a positive personal or professional interaction with someone does not automatically mean someone endorses every allegation made against that person. But the criticism persists because people aren't only looking at one interview anymore. They're looking at a pattern of public statements. They're asking why Blake seemed comfortable praising certain powerful men, while other women were publicly describing deeply disturbing experiences involving them. And for some critics, the disconnect is impossible to ignore. They argue that Blake's obsession with maintaining a glamorous, classic Hollywood image may have made it easier for her to separate the fantasy of Hollywood from the darker realities surrounding some of the people inside it. But there's another side to this debate. There is no evidence that Blake's professional interactions with these men were themselves inappropriate. There is also no basis for claiming she knowingly participated in misconduct simply because she worked with controversial figures. That distinction matters. What critics are really questioning is her public response. They argue that she didn't use her platform to strongly challenge the powerful men around her, and instead framed her relationships through professionalism, personal experience, and the promotion of her films. And that is where the conversation gets especially complicated. Because Hollywood remembers, studios remember, producers remember, directors remember. And according to some industry commentators, people quietly keep track of how actors behave when the cameras aren't rolling. Not necessarily in some secret blacklist, but in the much simpler sense that reputations travel. People talk. Executives compare notes. Directors remember difficult experiences. Producers remember who was cooperative. And casting decisions can be influenced by far more than what audiences ever see. Some critics now claim Blake developed a reputation for being difficult, overly controlling, or unwilling to simply remain within the boundaries of an acting role. Others strongly dispute that characterization. But one story repeatedly brought up in this conversation involves the 2012 crime thriller, Savages, directed by Oliver Stone. And this wasn't some tiny independent production. Oliver Stone was already one of the most established directors in Hollywood. His filmography included major movies such as Platoon, JFK, and Natural Born Killers. He had spent decades directing major productions and working with some of the biggest actors in the world. The cast of Savages included names such as John Travolta, Salma Hayek, and Benicio del Toro. And yet, according to accounts attributed to Stone and people involved with the production, Blake Lively reportedly had a significant number of suggestions and changes regarding her character and the screenplay. Now, having creative opinions isn't automatically a problem. Actors contribute ideas all the time. Some actors help improve dialogue. Some suggest changes to scenes. Some challenge character decisions. And sometimes those contributions genuinely make a movie better. The controversy begins when people believe an actor stops offering ideas and starts trying to control the production. That's the distinction critics make about Blake. According to accounts circulated about the production, she allegedly approached Stone with strong ideas about what her character should do, instead of simply asking for direction. And critics interpret that behavior as evidence that she wanted influence beyond the traditional role of an actor. But again, there's another possible interpretation. An ambitious actor can care deeply about a character. They can challenge a director. They can ask questions. They can advocate for a different interpretation. That doesn't automatically make someone arrogant or unprofessional. The real issue is how those disagreements were handled. And this is where the Savages story becomes much more dramatic. According to the accounts being circulated, Blake allegedly became frustrated when Stone questioned or challenged some of her ideas. Instead of viewing those questions as part of the creative process, critics claim she interpreted them as personal attacks. That alleged dynamic supposedly created tension on set, and according to some reports, Blake complained to co-star Salma Hayek about Stone's behavior. If accurate, that would obviously create a difficult situation on any film set. Because when disagreements between an actor and director start spreading through the cast, the problem stops being isolated. Suddenly, other actors are forced into the middle. People start choosing sides. Communication becomes more complicated. And a production that should be focused on making a movie becomes consumed by interpersonal conflict. But the story doesn't end there. Critics point to what they describe as the most controversial moment of the entire Savages production, the editing room. For people unfamiliar with filmmaking, the editing room is where the raw footage is transformed into the final movie. It's a highly controlled stage of production. The director works closely with editors to determine pacing, performances, structure, transitions, and ultimately what the audience sees. Actors generally aren't the people making those final decisions. But according to accounts repeated online, Blake allegedly pushed her way into that process. Critics interpreted that as another example of her desire for creative control. Whether she was actually forcing her way into the editing room or simply becoming involved in discussions is a matter that requires the original source and context. But the allegation has become part of the broader narrative surrounding her. And then came the detail that became almost impossible for the internet to forget: the shirts. After filming Wrapped, Blake reportedly had custom t-shirts made for members of the crew with the phrase, "I survived Oliver Stone." If that happened exactly as reported, it's certainly an unusual way to commemorate a production. Some people saw it as harmless humor, others saw it as humiliating the director. And that distinction became even more significant when Blake reportedly discussed the shirts during an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman. This story became a punchline, but critics weren't laughing. They argued that publicly joking about surviving a director was disrespectful, especially when that director was an established filmmaker who had spent decades building his career. Supporters, however, could argue that the shirts were simply an inside joke shared among cast and crew. And that's another example of how the same event can produce completely different interpretations. Was it playful? Was it disrespectful? Was it simply Hollywood humor? Or did it reveal deeper tension between Blake and Stone? We can't know someone's private intentions from a joke alone, but the incident became part of Blake's public narrative anyway. And years later, another interview made the story even more interesting. In 2022, Blake discussed her creative ambitions at the Forbes Power Women's Summit. And this time, she openly acknowledged something that critics immediately connected to the old. Savages. Controversy. She explained that when she went into meetings for acting roles, she would sometimes present herself primarily as an actor seeking the job, but she admitted that internally, she wanted much more. She wanted authorship. She wanted creative involvement. She wanted to contribute to writing, costumes, and the broader creative direction. And that confession is where critics say everything suddenly clicked. Because Blake wasn't denying that she wanted creative control. She was explaining it herself. Her point was essentially that simply showing up, standing on a designated mark, and delivering lines no longer fulfilled her creatively. She wanted to participate in the larger filmmaking process. And honestly, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. Actors can become writers. Actors can become producers. Actors can direct. Actors can develop projects. Actors can demand creative control. Some of Hollywood's most successful careers were built precisely because performers refused to remain limited to one role. So ambition itself isn't the problem. The controversy comes from something else. Blake acknowledged that she didn't always reveal the full extent of those ambitions during the initial hiring process. She explained that during meetings, she would present herself as someone simply looking to be the actor hired for the role, while not necessarily revealing that she ultimately wanted significant authorship and creative involvement. And that's the part critics seized on. They argued that a director could reasonably feel blindsided if an actor joined a production under one set of expectations and then pushed for substantially more control once the job was secured. Blake herself acknowledged that directors could potentially experience it as a rug pull, and that phrase became incredibly important, because suddenly the criticism wasn't simply, "Blake is too ambitious." It became, "Does she reveal her full creative expectations before accepting the role?" That's a completely different question, and it's one worth examining carefully, because if an actor wants creative control, there is nothing wrong with negotiating for it. The transparent approach would simply be to discuss those expectations before signing on. That way, everyone knows the boundaries. The director knows, the producers know, the studio knows, the actor knows, and everyone can decide whether the arrangement works. But if someone enters a project under the assumption that they're only being hired to perform and then attempts to dramatically expand their authority after production begins, that can create serious friction. That's why Blake's 2022 comments became so significant to critics. They believed she had unintentionally explained the exact dynamic they had been accusing her of for years, but calling that fraud would be an exaggeration without evidence of deliberate deception for unlawful gain. It's more accurately described as a potential mismatch between what was communicated during hiring and what the actor later wanted creatively. And that distinction matters, because viral commentary often takes a complicated professional disagreement and turns it into a criminal accusation. The reality can be much more ordinary. An ambitious actor wants more control. A director wants to maintain authority. A studio wants the production to stay on schedule. A disagreement develops. People remember it differently. Years later, the internet turns the entire thing into a morality play. But Blake's own words are still revealing. She openly admitted that she didn't always enter those meetings announcing every creative ambition she had. And that admission gives critics plenty to discuss, because it suggests that her transformation from actor to creative force may have been more deliberate than audiences realized. She wasn't satisfied with simply performing. She wanted influence. She wanted authorship. She wanted a voice in the visual identity of projects. She wanted input into costumes. She wanted to shape stories. And again, none of that is inherently wrong. In fact, those ambitions can be signs of serious artistic confidence. The real controversy is how that ambition interacted with the people already running those productions. Did Blake collaborate? Did she challenge? Did she overstep? Did directors welcome her contributions? Or did some feel that their authority was being undermined? Those are the questions that matter. And that's why the Oliver Stone story continues to resurface. Because critics see it as an early example of the same creative control issue Blake later openly described herself. One side sees an ambitious actress who wanted more ownership over her work. The other sees someone who allegedly struggled to accept boundaries once she had secured the role. And somewhere between those two interpretations is likely a much more complicated reality. But one thing is certain. Blake Lively's public image is no longer being judged solely by her movies. People are examining how she handles power, how she handles criticism, how she works with directors, how she responds to controversy, and how she navigates relationships with some of Hollywood's most influential people. That is a much bigger conversation than any single movie. And if the scrutiny continues, those questions are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Imagine getting hired to do one job, walking onto a production, and then revealing that you actually had an entirely different ambition all along. That is the accusation critics have been making about Blake Lively. Their argument is that she wasn't simply an actress who wanted to contribute creatively. They claim directors and producers could have felt blindsided when she pushed for influence beyond what they believed they had originally hired her to do. But there's an important distinction here. Wanting creative control is not inherently wrong. Actors become producers. Actors become directors. Actors write. Actors develop projects. Creative ambition can be a strength. The controversy is about transparency. If someone is hired primarily as an actor but privately expects significant authorship and control over writing, costumes, editing, or the overall production, then a director or studio could reasonably feel that the expectations were different from what they understood when the person was hired. And Blake herself has publicly acknowledged that she sometimes didn't reveal the full extent of those creative ambitions during initial meetings. That admission is precisely why critics continue bringing the issue up. But then the story takes another turn, because critics argue Blake didn't just build a career around acting. They claim she also became increasingly focused on building a carefully managed public image, a wholesome image, a charitable image, a glamorous image, a good person image. And according to this theory, the strategy was simple. If the public sees you as generous, compassionate, fashionable, successful, and deeply involved in worthy causes, then negative stories about your professional behavior become easier to dismiss. Again, that is a theory about motivation, not an established fact. But it is one of the reasons Blake's charity work has come under renewed scrutiny. One organization repeatedly mentioned in online discussions is the Child Rescue Coalition. Blake has participated in efforts focused on protecting children and has spoken publicly about the importance of safeguarding vulnerable young people. Those causes are serious. The underlying issues are serious. And supporting them is not inherently suspicious. But critics have asked an uncomfortable question. Why did Blake appear willing to speak passionately about protecting vulnerable people, while also receiving criticism for her past comments about controversial Hollywood figures? That contradiction is what fuels the backlash. Critics argue that public activism doesn't automatically erase questions about someone's professional conduct, and at the same time, it's equally unfair to claim that charitable involvement is merely a publicity stunt without evidence. That's the line that often gets lost in viral celebrity commentary. A person can genuinely support a charity while also making questionable professional decisions. Those things can coexist. But the internet tends to demand a simple answer: hero or villain, authentic or fake, victim or manipulator. And Blake's image has increasingly become trapped in that binary. Then the conversation shifts toward Ryan Reynolds. Because once Blake's public image comes under pressure, people naturally start asking what role her husband plays in all of this. There have been online allegations about social media manipulation, purchased followers, coordinated engagement, and attempts to suppress criticism involving the couple. But those claims remain allegations unless backed by reliable evidence. There is a huge difference between saying something is being discussed online and proving that Blake or Ryan personally ordered or participated in such activity. Still, the claims have become part of the larger narrative because people are already questioning how carefully the couple manages its public image. For years, Blake and Ryan have been one of Hollywood's most recognizable celebrity couples. Their relationship has been marketed through humor, playful social media exchanges, major film premieres, business ventures, red carpet appearances, and carefully controlled public moments. That branding has been incredibly effective, but when public perception changes, the same carefully crafted image can suddenly become a target. People start asking, how much of it is authentic? How much is marketing? How much is strategic? And how much of what the public sees is actually happening behind the scenes? Those questions became even louder during the promotional campaign surrounding It Ends With Us. The movie dealt with extremely serious subject matter involving domestic abuse. That meant the promotional campaign carried an unusual responsibility. Viewers expected conversations about the film's themes, the characters, the story, the realities of abusive relationships, the emotional weight of the subject matter. Instead, critics became increasingly focused on Blake's lifestyle branding. She was photographed at events featuring floral themes. She promoted products connected to her businesses. Her beverage brands entered the conversation. And suddenly, critics argued that the marketing campaign felt more like a lifestyle launch than a sensitive discussion about the subject matter of the film. That criticism exploded online. Some viewers felt the promotional strategy was tone-deaf. Others argued that Blake was simply using the tools available to her as a celebrity entrepreneur. But the controversy became much bigger when alcohol entered the conversation. Blake's beverage branding became connected to the film's promotional ecosystem, including references to her products and her husband's aviation gin. Critics questioned whether promoting alcohol alongside a film centered on domestic violence and the consequences of rage and drinking was an appropriate choice. Again, there are different interpretations. A brand promotion does not automatically mean someone is trivializing the subject matter, but the optics were undeniably controversial. And optics matter enormously in Hollywood, especially when a celebrity is already under scrutiny. Because once audiences become skeptical, they start interpreting every decision through that skepticism. A cocktail promotion that might have looked harmless under different circumstances suddenly looks insensitive. A fashion event suddenly looks like distraction. A business advertisement suddenly looks exploitative, and a celebrity's attempt to promote multiple projects simultaneously can become evidence of a much larger criticism. That's exactly what happened to Blake's image. Then came the business backlash. Blake had launched multiple consumer brands, including her hair care line and beverage ventures, and online critics began circulating dramatic claims about declining sales, product returns, retail performance, and consumer backlash. Some social media users claimed they had heard negative comments from retail employees. Others shared anecdotes about products being returned, and some posts alleged that products were being heavily discounted or moved to clearance. But individual anecdotes are not the same thing as verified company-wide sales data. A single customer service employee saying a product was being returned cannot prove an entire business has collapsed. That distinction is important. Yet the stories spread because they fit the larger narrative people were already building. The idea was that Blake's celebrity businesses were supposedly suffering because consumers had turned against her. And suddenly, every retail photograph became potential evidence. A clearance sticker, an empty shelf, a discounted product, a missing display, a social media complaint. Everything was interpreted as part of the same collapse. Her beverage brands also became targets of criticism. Some online users claimed that products associated with Blake had disappeared from prominent retail locations. Others pointed to changes involving her non-alcoholic beverage business. Again, those observations do not automatically establish that a business has failed. Retail placement changes constantly. Products move. Stores change inventory. Companies discontinue products. Brands restructure. And consumer demand fluctuates. But once the Blake backlash reached a certain level, every change became part of the conversation. Then came perhaps the most damaging claim of all. What happened to her Hollywood projects? This is where critics began assembling a list. Blake's production company, B for Effort, has been repeatedly discussed in connection with projects that faced delays, development problems, or changes in status. One example frequently mentioned is Dark Days at the Magna Carta, a post-apocalyptic project associated with Netflix. Another is Lady Killer, a comic book adaptation that was announced but faced development challenges. Then there was Seconds, a project associated with Searchlight and reportedly intended to mark Blake's directorial ambitions. Critics began presenting these stalled projects as proof that studios were refusing to work with her. But that conclusion goes much further than the available evidence. Hollywood projects collapse constantly. Scripts get rewritten. Actors leave. Budgets change. Studios shift priorities. Executives change. Streaming strategies evolve. Movies that appear guaranteed to happen can disappear overnight. That doesn't automatically mean one person was blacklisted. Still, the pattern is what critics focus on. They ask, why are so many Blake-associated projects struggling to reach production? Is it normal Hollywood development chaos? Or are studios becoming more cautious about attaching major projects to her? Those questions are legitimate to ask. But saying that Hollywood has officially blacklisted Blake Lively would require direct evidence from studios, producers, or reliable industry reporting. And that evidence should not simply be assumed. The same applies to claims that male actors are refusing to work with her. That's an especially serious allegation. There would need to be reliable reporting or direct statements before treating it as fact. But online commentators have certainly used the claim to explain why Blake's future projects appear uncertain. And then there's Ryan, because if Blake's career is supposedly collapsing, what does that mean for her husband? Some critics have dramatically described the situation as humiliating for Ryan Reynolds as well. But again, there is no reliable basis for claiming Ryan has been blacklisted from Hollywood. He's an established actor, producer, and entrepreneur with a substantial career independent of Blake. What can be discussed is whether controversies surrounding the couple affect public perception of their joint brand. That's a reasonable question. But claiming their careers are officially over is another matter entirely. The same goes for another simple favor. The movie's release strategy and availability have generated plenty of online speculation, with critics portraying streaming distribution as evidence that Blake's theatrical career is collapsing. But movies are routinely distributed through streaming platforms for strategic, financial, or scheduling reasons. A streaming release alone does not prove a studio is trying to hide a movie or avoid a box office disaster. That's another place where viral commentary can go far beyond what the facts actually establish. Still, the broader perception problem remains. Blake's image has taken a serious hit among certain online audiences, and perception can have real consequences. When audiences stop trusting a celebrity's image, every new project becomes harder to market. When journalists become skeptical, every interview becomes more difficult. When fans become divided, social media campaigns become unpredictable. And when a celebrity's name itself becomes part of the controversy, the promotional campaign can start overshadowing the actual movie. That is exactly what happened during the It Ends With Us promotional cycle. Instead of the movie being discussed primarily as a serious drama, conversations about the cast, behind-the-scenes tension, marketing decisions, celebrity brands, and public statements began dominating the story. And that may ultimately be one of the biggest lessons from this entire controversy. A celebrity can spend years building a carefully controlled image, but one controversial project can expose cracks that were previously invisible. Then every old interview gets resurfaced, every business decision gets questioned, every friendship becomes suspicious, every public appearance becomes analyzed. And suddenly, the image that once protected the celebrity becomes the very thing people want to challenge. That's where Blake finds herself now. Critics say she believed her fame, beauty, wealth, celebrity friendships, and carefully constructed public persona would protect her from consequences. Supporters would argue that she's being unfairly targeted and that the internet has transformed normal Hollywood disagreements into a coordinated attack. And the truth may be more complicated than either side wants to admit. But one thing is undeniable: the conversation surrounding Blake Lively has changed. The questions are no longer limited to one movie. They're about power. They're about creative control. They're about celebrity branding. They're about public relations. They're about business. They're about Hollywood relationships. And most importantly, they're about whether the image presented to the public matches the reality behind the scenes. And that's a question no amount of polished Instagram content can permanently erase. Because once audiences start questioning the image, every new move gets examined. Every project becomes a test. Every interview becomes a potential headline. And every business launch becomes another opportunity for people to decide whether they still believe the celebrity standing in front of them. So is Blake Lively really finished in Hollywood? The evidence does not justify declaring that as a confirmed fact. But is she facing a serious public relations crisis? Absolutely. And if she wants to rebuild public trust, simply posting another glamorous photograph or launching another product may not be enough. The public is asking for something much harder: authenticity, accountability, and answers. Because in Hollywood, careers can survive bad headlines. They can survive failed movies. They can survive business setbacks. What is much harder to survive is a collapse in trust. And right now, trust is exactly what Blake's critics say she has lost. According to her harshest critics, Blake Lively didn't simply make one bad decision. They believe the bigger problem was a pattern. A pattern of believing she could walk into a production as an actress while secretly expecting far more creative authority than the producers thought they were hiring her for. A pattern of believing she could build an image so carefully that criticism would never reach her. And, perhaps most controversially, a pattern of using the very real subject of domestic violence as the backdrop for promoting products connected to her lifestyle brand. That last criticism became especially powerful because It Ends With Us dealt with an extremely serious subject. Domestic violence isn't a marketing gimmick. It's something that affects real people, real families, and real survivors. So when the promotional campaign became heavily intertwined with fashion, cocktails, beauty products, and celebrity branding, critics felt the seriousness of the movie was being pushed into the background. And that is where the backlash became much bigger than a disagreement about publicity. For critics, it became symbolic. They saw it as evidence that Blake had become so focused on branding and celebrity power that she had lost sight of the responsibility that came with the project. Now combine that with the older controversies. The disputes surrounding creative control, the stories about difficult production relationships, the resurfaced interviews involving powerful Hollywood figures, the questions surrounding her public image, the backlash surrounding the "It Ends With Us" promotional tour, and the allegations and counter-allegations surrounding her legal battle with Justin Baldoni. When you put all of those pieces together, critics argue that the lawsuit wasn't necessarily the beginning of Blake's problems. They believe it was the moment everything that had been building underneath finally became impossible to ignore. In their view, Blake didn't suddenly make one catastrophic mistake. She simply ran out of runway. For years, celebrity culture can protect people from consequences. Fame creates opportunities. Money creates options. Connections open doors. Publicists manage narratives. Studios protect valuable talent. Fans defend celebrities they love. And as long as the machine keeps working, problems can remain hidden behind the success. But Hollywood is ultimately an ecosystem built on relationships. Collaboration matters. Trust matters. Professional respect matters. And public goodwill matters. If enough of those relationships become damaged, even an extremely successful celebrity can eventually feel the consequences. That's the argument being made about Blake right now. Critics claim that she damaged all three: collaboration, respect, goodwill. They argue that directors and producers became frustrated by her alleged desire for greater control. They argue that her public comments created unnecessary controversy. And they argue that the marketing choices surrounding "It Ends With Us" alienated audiences who expected a more sensitive approach to such serious subject matter. But again, there is an important distinction between criticism and established fact. There is no confirmed evidence that Blake has been formally blacklisted by Hollywood. There is no verified announcement from studio heads declaring her unemployable. There is no official industry-wide ban. And claims that every major talent agency has abandoned her should not simply be repeated as fact without reliable evidence. What can be said is that her public image has experienced significant controversy. And that can absolutely affect a celebrity's career. Studios pay attention to audience reaction. Brands pay attention to consumers. Producers pay attention to risk. And celebrities are increasingly judged not only by their performances, but by the amount of controversy surrounding their names. That's why the current situation is so important. The Blake Lively brand was never just about movies. It was about lifestyle, fashion, family, business, beauty, alcohol, social media, celebrity friendships, and a carefully constructed image of glamour mixed with relatability. For years, that combination worked. But when the public begins questioning the image itself, everything connected to the brand can become vulnerable. A product launch becomes controversial. A movie promotion becomes controversial. An old interview becomes controversial. A friendship becomes controversial. And suddenly, the celebrity isn't controlling the story anymore. The audience is. That may be the biggest change Blake is facing. For a long time, the public largely accepted the version of Blake presented through interviews, red carpets, social media, magazine covers, and promotional campaigns. But now, critics are actively questioning that version. They are going back through her career. They are comparing old interviews with newer statements. They are examining professional relationships. They are looking at business decisions. And they are asking whether the glamorous image was always an accurate representation of what happened behind the scenes. That doesn't mean every accusation is true. It doesn't mean every rumor deserves belief. And it certainly doesn't mean every criticism automatically proves wrongdoing. But once public trust begins to disappear, rebuilding it can be incredibly difficult. That's the real danger for any celebrity. Not one bad headline. Not one failed project. Not one controversial interview. It's the accumulation. One controversy becomes two. Two become five. And eventually, audiences stop seeing each incident individually. They start seeing a pattern. Whether that pattern is accurate or not, the perception itself can become powerful. And that brings us right back to Justin Baldoni. Because the legal conflict surrounding it ends with us. Transformed what might otherwise have been a temporary promotional controversy into a much larger public battle. Instead of people simply debating the movie, audiences began debating the people behind it. Who was telling the truth? Who handled the situation appropriately? Who benefited from the media coverage? Who controlled the narrative? And who lost public trust? The legal process is where those claims should ultimately be tested. Social media is not a courtroom. A viral TikTok isn't evidence by itself. A Reddit thread isn't a verdict. And an emotional YouTube video cannot determine what actually happened behind closed doors. But public perception doesn't always wait for the legal process. That's what makes celebrity controversies so dangerous. People form opinions long before every fact is established. And once those opinions become entrenched, changing them can be extremely difficult. For Blake, that means the biggest challenge may not simply be getting another movie. It may be rebuilding credibility. Can audiences believe her again? Can studios feel comfortable attaching expensive projects to her? Can brands confidently put her name on products? Can filmmakers trust her creative boundaries? Can she participate in another serious film without the promotional campaign becoming the story? Those are much bigger questions than whether one particular project succeeds. And if Blake wants to move forward, critics would argue that the solution isn't another carefully polished public relations campaign. It isn't another glamorous photo shoot. It isn't another celebrity party. And it isn't another product launch. It would require something far more difficult: transparency, consistency, and possibly accountability. Because audiences are becoming much more skeptical of celebrity branding. They don't necessarily want perfection. They want authenticity. They want celebrities to acknowledge mistakes when mistakes happen. They want serious issues treated seriously. And they increasingly recognize when a promotional campaign feels more focused on selling something than communicating the meaning behind a project. That's why it ends with us. Controversy became such a turning point in the public conversation surrounding Blake. The movie was supposed to be the center of attention. Instead, the marketing became part of the controversy. The cast became part of the controversy. The behind-the-scenes allegations became part of the controversy. And eventually, Blake herself became the story. That's an incredibly dangerous position for any actor. Because once the audience is discussing the celebrity more than the movie, the actual work can disappear underneath the noise. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. Blake spent years building an image associated with Hollywood glamour, influence, and control. But now, according to her critics, that very image is working against her. The more carefully controlled the public persona appears, the more people want to know what exists underneath it. The more polished the branding becomes, the more audiences question whether it's authentic. The more powerful the celebrity appears, the more intensely people examine how that power is being used. And the more controversies accumulate, the harder it becomes to dismiss each one as an isolated misunderstanding. But is Blake Lively truly an industry pariah? That's still a conclusion not a confirmed fact. Is she officially blacklisted? There is no solid public evidence establishing that. Has Hollywood completely abandoned her? Again, that would be an enormous claim requiring far stronger evidence than online speculation. What we can say is that she has experienced a major backlash, and the public conversation around her has become significantly more negative in some corners of the internet. And that matters, because celebrity careers depend heavily on perception. A-list status isn't simply about talent. It's also about relationships, demand, audience trust, commercial value, and whether studios believe audiences still want to see you. That is why the coming years will be important. Will Blake successfully rebuild her image? Will she return with a major project that changes the conversation? Will the public eventually move on? Will the legal disputes fade into the background? Or will every new project continue reopening the same questions? Nobody knows yet. And that's what makes this story so unpredictable. Because Blake Lively's future hasn't been written. The internet may be declaring the end of her career today, but Hollywood has repeatedly shown that celebrity narratives can change overnight. A comeback is always possible. So is another controversy. The next chapter could completely change the way audiences see her. And that brings us to the question I want to ask you. After everything we've discussed, do you think Blake Lively's current backlash is the natural consequence of years of questionable decisions and poor judgment? Or do you think the internet and Hollywood are being far too harsh on her? Do you believe the controversy surrounding "It ends with us" was the moment everything finally exploded? Or do you think the problems were already building long before Justin Baldoni entered the picture? And most importantly, what do you think was Blake's biggest mistake? Was it the alleged creative control conflicts? Was it her handling of controversial Hollywood figures? Was it the way she promoted "It ends with us"? Was it the legal battle? Or was it the decision to build such a carefully controlled celebrity brand in the first place? Drop your opinion in the comments. I genuinely want to know which side you're on. And if you made it all the way to the end, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this story is far from settled. As more information comes out, the entire narrative could change again. And when it does, we'll be here to break it all down.